Oh, American Senator. Yeah, American Senator was, as you probably know, Anthony Trollope's 34th novel. Astonishing, really, but there you go. And he still wasn't finished. His 34th novel, written in 1875 when he was 60, and published over the course of the following 2 years as a serial in the monthly magazine Temple Bar, in 15 installments from May 1876 to July 1877, and then as a 3-volume book, or 3-decker, as such novels were called, or novels in that format were known, from Chapman and Hall in June 1877. As a serial, it appeared in installments of 5 short chapters a month. And when reading it, you might want to think about that, you know, every 5th chapter completes section in the experience of original readers, and I think actually probably to some extent in Trollope's conception of the book. And it continued to appear in five chapter sections until the summer of 1877, when, with the end drawing nigh, the dose was somewhat increased. 6 chapters in May 1877, and then 7 in both June and July to bring the story to its conclusion. Initially, it overlapped in Temple Bar with Wilkie Collins's novel The Two Destinies, which was a supernatural tale involving telepathy between 2 childhood friends who subsequently married. Later, it overlapped with Cherry Ripe by Helen Mathers, which was the pseudonym of Ellen Matthews, whose first novel, Coming Through the Rye, had been a bestseller in 1875. Mathers's many novels, he published 1 a year for several decades, many novels were thought to be daringly erotic, or at least improperly frank, in their accounts of their heroines' love lives. The Athenaeum, in fact, would review Cherry Ripe as, I quote, a disgusting book in 1878, which might suggest that publishing in Temple Bar was a bit of a move down market for Trollope. This was a shilling monthly magazine aimed at a less sophisticated audience than the Cornhill or St. Paul's. Trollope had refused the offer of editorship in 1861, and the American Senator was the only thing he ever published there. In fact, I think one should not make too much of this. As well as Wilkie Collins, Temple Bar would publish fiction by Charles Reade and Henry Kingsley, Rhoda Broughton, Mrs. Henry Wood, George Gissing, and Robert Louis Stevenson. Trollope's brother Tom contributed articles, and in 1882, Trollope himself would offer his last novel, Landleaguers, to the editor of Temple Bar, George Bentley, serialization, though in fact it was declined. Bentley paid Trollope a very considerable sum of £600 for the serial rights to the American Senator, which is probably about £60,000 in modern money. And Chapman and Hall, incidentally, would pay another £1,200 for the book rights. And when Bentley tried to change the title, because he thought it would suggest that the action was set in America, and that would put off readers, he graciously accepted Trollope's downright refusal to do so. In the words of Trollope's letter, "I find I cannot change the name, which indeed I feel in itself to be a good name. I am sure that nobody can give a name to a novel but the author," even though Trollope himself would concede in the first sentence of the concluding chapter that the book, I quote, might perhaps have been better called The Chronicle of a Winter at Dillsborough. Trollope's previous novel, by date of composition, Is He Poppyjoy, and his next novel, The Duke's Children, would be serialized in All the Year Round, a mere company weekly, which had begun in the 1860s with A Tale of Two Cities, Great Expectations, The Woman in White and the Moonstone, but by the late 1860s was publishing rather less distinguished novelists. Temple Bar was a cut above that. Seen in the long perspective of Trollope's career, the American Senator is once again interestingly located. The Barsetshire series had been completed 10 years previously, unless you include, as I do, the short story, The Two Heroines of Plumplington in 1882. But the Palliser series was still underway. The Prime Minister, written in 1874, began its appearance in part issue in November 1875, a month before Trollope delivered the manuscript of The American Senator to the printers. The Duke's Children would be written between May and October 1876 and begin publication in October 1879. American Senator is, in other words, one of the several novels which interrupt or punctuate the sequence of what Trollope was only very gradually coming to think of as a Palliser series. Its controversial title is, I think, in part a reflection of this. Trollope's previous novel, by date of publication at least, had been called The Prime Minister. A year later, he writes a book about a correspondingly senior American politician, the American senator. Not the president, because it would be impossible to imagine his taking a 7-month leave of absence to visit England, as the senator does, but the next best thing. Trollope had offered, through the mouth of Plantagenet Palliser, an English view of the political process in the Prime Minister. He could now, correspondingly, offer what he understood to be the American view of it, in both cases focused on the circumstances of British life in the 1870s. The novel is set, and we are told this explicitly within the text, though you have to look quite hard to find it. It's set between November 1874 and May 1875. So it's about a very particular moment, and Trollope is thinking about that moment and indeed using this foreign voice, this American voice, to comment on it. Well, this prompts first of the two most interesting questions, as I see them, about this novel. It's the issue, that is, of its relationship to contemporary circumstances, both political and philosophical. How topical is it? What is the force of American criticism of Britain in the mid-1870s? And what is the context of that criticism? Have we perhaps forgotten this since the book was first published? In other words, would original readers have known that and not needed to be told, but have we since forgotten it? How justified or not is the rejection of the senator's views by his British hosts and auditors? What is the relevance, if any, of the references to Patagonia? It's simply a sort of mildly comic place that one of the characters might, in fact, two of the characters, 3, if you include Arabella, might end up. How serious is the novel's engagement with the woman question in the person of Arabella Trefoil and her ruthless search for a suitable husband? And again, what is the immediate contemporary context of that issue? And what do we make of such apparently philosophical statements as Arabella's remark in chapter 56 that, I quote, "There are no such things as love and friendship." Very reverberant, extraordinary statement. There are no such things as love and friendship. How pertinent is that to the action of the book? Or, for that matter, Reginald Morton's recommendation in chapter 73 of, I quote, "the great doctrine of plenty." What is the great doctrine of plenty, and how relevant is that to our understanding of the book? Is this a serious novel, in other words, both politically and, one might say, philosophically, or simply an agreeable concoction of hunting scenes and love stories? If you are tempted to find it parochial, you should perhaps consider that the setting in Hillsborough, or Hull Town, is a piece of conscious irony, And remember that Trollope started writing the novel on a ranch in Western Australia and completed it on a ship during a voyage across the Pacific to San Francisco. That might suggest a certain cosmopolitanism of view. Other great question is one of quality, that is, the book standing as a work of art. The American Senator was written and published at what one might see as the peak of Trollope's career. A decade of, I'm using book publication rather than magazine publication dates here, the decade of The Eustace Diamond, 1872, Phineas Redux, 1873, Lady Anna, 1874, The Way We Live Now, 1875, The Prime Minister, 1876, Is He Popenjoy, 1878, Cousin Henry and John Caldegat in 1879, and The Duke's Children. And yet, as we all know, Trollope's reputation in the 1870s was not that of a great artist, a novelist who had reached a high level of mature and assured achievement. Instead, his work was increasingly criticised, in part for overproduction. Many novels, An Eye for an Eye, written in 1870, would not appear until 1878 because of fears that he was oversupplying the market, but also because of a sense that his technique had perhaps become outdated or old-fashioned. The reviews of The American Senator, when it appeared as a book in 1877, were not as hostile as the reviews of The Prime Minister had been in 1876. In an autobiography, Trollope would observe that neither The American Senator nor Is He Popenjoy had, quote, encountered that reproach which in regard to the Prime Minister seemed to tell me that my work as a novelist should be brought to a close, even though they are, in Trollope's own view, I quote, very inferior to the Prime Minister. But they were still not at all friendly. Examiner in July 1877 regretted that, I quote, Mr. Trollope has not yet recovered from the attack of misanthropy which he was suffering when he wrote The Way We Live Now. Athenaeum in June 1877 admired the picture of life in Dillsborough. The detail is minute and there is an indefinable humour, but remarked, I quote, it is not one of Mr. Trollope's best books. The Senator might be cut out almost without affecting the story. And his lecture on British institutions is as near to being a bore as anything Mr. Trollope could write. Saturday Review similarly found it, I quote, pleasant reading, but would have, quote, liked it quite as well if the part of the Senator had been left out. And though the Times too felt that it leaves very pleasant impressions behind, it was more brutal about the structure of the book. Quote, Senator himself is an excrescence on the work, which he gives his name, and has nothing whatever to do with the double story. Peter in August 1878, this structural point still further, I quote, the Senator appears merely, I quote, to fill up the gaps. And there is a fourth point of interest, almost entirely of the padding order, concerned with the poisoning of a fox in one of the Hunt's favourite covers. Well, the Examiner's criticism bears upon what I've called the philosophical content, or not, of the novel, such as Arabella's bitter comment that there are no such things as love and friendship, and is a relatively unusual complaint. Structural criticisms are more frequent and reflect a major shift in attitude to or understanding of the novel as a form in the 1870s. The classic statement of this new view of prose fiction was actually published slightly later, Henry James's essay, The Art of Fiction, which first appeared in Longman's magazine in 1884. Only a short time ago, James declared, it might have been supposed that the English novel was not what the French call discutable. It had no air of having a theory, a conviction, a consciousness of itself behind it, of being the expression of an artistic faith, the result of choice and composition, unquote. Now, in James's view, it has, and the new model for the creation of prose fiction shall be the work of Turgenev and Flaubert. The beauty of the novelist, James concluded, was, I quote, "be as complete as possible, make as perfect a work, be generous and delicate, and pursue the prize," unquote. Novels with multiple plots, intrusive narrators, and extraneous material, like The American Senator, did not fit this new standard. And James had, in fact, expressed a version of this view 11 years earlier in his 1873 review of George Eliot's novel, Middlemarch. I quote, I'm going to quote James. Quote, "We can all remember how keenly we wondered, while its early chapters unfolded themselves, what turn in the way of form the story would take. That of an organized, molded, balanced composition, gratifying the reader with a sense of design and construction, or a mere chain of episodes broken into accidental lengths and unconscious of the influence of a plan. We expected the actual result, but for the sake of English imaginative literature, which in this line is rarely in need of examples, we hoped for the other. If it had come, we should have had the pleasure of reading what certainly would have seemed to us in the immediate glow of attention, the first of English novels. But the pleasure has still to hover between prospect and retrospect. Middlemarch," here comes the famous phrase, "Middlemarch is a treasure house of details, but it is an indifferent whole." In James's view, Middlemarch, I quote, "sets a limit to the development of the old-fashioned English novel," unquote. And Trollope's work, though James, it's true, would later, after Trollope's death, come to somewhat regret his dismissive attitude, Trollope's work falls very much into his old-fashioned category, as his savage attack on the Belton estate in 1866 had suggested. Well, is James right? Is The American Senator an indifferent whole, or, as other critics in the 1870s had suggested, disorganized, miscellaneous, and artistically imperfect? This question is really two questions. First, to what extent are we obliged to accept James's assumptions, or feel them still to be authoritative 140 years later? Do all novels have to be unified? Must they all have, in his words, molded, balanced composition, unquote? Might there not be virtue in variety? Might the novels of the era prior to the Jamesian art novel, as it was called, not have their own distinctive merits? And second, to what extent does The American Senator in fact meet James's criteria? Are there ways, unnoticed perhaps by the reviewers in the 1870s, in which it's actually more coherent, more unified, more perfect, in James's word, than one might at first assume? I'm sure you will find it, as Saturday Review did, pleasant reading. I wonder whether you might, in fact, discover it to be rather more than that. Thank you.